least soften his support for the filibuster. If Republicans are blocking a bill that literally says, don't overturn elections, I feel like that's the bill that would get him to budge.
So when it comes to what lawmakers pay the most attention to, which is what their voters want and what's going to get them reelected, Sarah, you mentioned that there was polling that showed that parts of the For the People Act were pretty popular. Things like automatic voter registration, ending gerrymandering, which is one of the more wide-ranging things within the For the People Act, these things poll relatively well. So does voter ID, to be clear, as you mentioned. According to a report today published by the New York Times, the Democratic group Priorities USA is going to spend $20 million on promoting these voting rights efforts, things like that. When it comes to the midterms or something like that, do people vote based on this?
Historically, voting laws have not been something that reach the top of voters' top priorities. Those are typically the economy, healthcare, maybe immigration in a distant third. And often, though, it's very practical bread and butter needs. One thing that came up a lot, for instance, in the lead up to the 2018 midterms, was that the Mueller report and the Russia investigation were not top priorities for voters. I think what's happening right now face a very similar trajectory. That said, though, it's tied up in broader cultural stances around what does the Democratic Party stand for, what does the Republican Party stand for. It's just harder, I think, to isolate the extent to which that drives a voter's behavior, but it's definitely part of the story that each party is trying to tell in the lead up to 2022.
I think it's really interesting. I just don't think that voting rights as an issue has really been tested. It hasn't been front of mind the way it has been these last 6 months, really at any point in modern history. So I'm really interested to see if it is something that motivates people. I could see, for example, I think Nate has made this point on the podcast, that maybe Democrats are able to avoid the typical midterm swoon because they feel like they're really amped up to vote because they feel like democracy is truly in danger.
I think it would be smart politically for Democrats to use this as a wedge issue in 2022 and future elections if nothing passes. If there is some vote on the For the People Act in the Senate and all Democrats are a united front and Republicans are against that, I mean, that basically clarifies for even the least engaged voter where the two parties stand on voting rights. I don't know if voting rights is something that's going to be top of mind for voters heading into the ballot box, because like Sarah said, historically it has not been. But with the stakes being as high as they are, and with this big push at the state and federal level, essentially to restrict voting rights, I wonder if it will hold more importance to voters going forward.
All right. Let's move on and talk about the debate playing out in states over critical race theory. But first, today's podcast is brought to you by another 538 podcast, Hot Takedown. Each Tuesday, check out 538's sports podcast, Hot Takedown, where the hot takes of the sports world meet the numbers that prove them right or tear them down. The crew digs into fiery opinions from the week in sports and measures them according to the analytics behind the issue. They end each week's show by diving into a rabbit hole of data from the strangest 50-point games in the NBA to the ever larger goalies of the NHL. Don't miss Hot Takedown, available every Tuesday wherever you find your podcasts. Today's podcast is brought to you by ABC's new podcast, Life Out Loud with LZ Granderson. It's Pride Month, and you can celebrate Pride with a collection of inspiring, provocative conversations with some of the most influential voices and allies of the LGBTQ community. This season, Life Out Loud explores the policies, cultural touchstones, and major moments in history that have helped shape the queer experience. Guests include Pose star MJ Rodriguez, musician Rufus Wainwright, Drs. Rachel Levine and Anthony Fauci, Senator Tammy Baldwin, and more. Listen to Life Out Loud with LZ Granderson. It's available now wherever you get your podcasts. That's Life Out Loud with LZ Granderson. In the wake of George Floyd's murder and last summer's large-scale protests, conversation about the role that racism plays in American life have been far more present in politics, media, business, and in the culture writ large. Concepts like structural racism have become a popular part of Democratic politicians' lexicon, and there's also been a backlash, particularly to ideas like critical race theory and the New York Times Magazine's 1619 Project, which took a critical look at the role slavery played in the founding of the United States of America. More recently, states like Florida and Texas have moved to ban teaching of the 1619 Project or critical race theory in schools, and it's become a hot button issue in schools around the country. So let's talk about the contours of this political debate and what Americans think about it. And to start, one of the things that we do see in polling is that a lot of Americans don't really know what critical race theory is. So here's a definition I found from the Wall Street Journal. It's, quote, critical race theory is an academic concept first developed by legal scholars in the early 1970s. It argues the legacy of white supremacy remains embedded in modern-day society through laws and institutions that were fundamental in shaping American society. And then a Purdue University summary of critical race theory expanded on that. Quote, most CRT scholarship attempts to demonstrate not only how racism continues to be a pervasive component throughout dominant society, but also why this persistent racism problematically denies individuals many of the constitutional freedoms they are otherwise promised in the United States governing documents, end quote. So, first of all, I want to get a sense of whether those definitions of critical race theory are basically what the debate is about in politics. Is this what politicians are talking about when they're debating critical race theory, or has it morphed into something else?
This is pretty on par with the definition I've seen of CRT too. Its backers will say, like you said, Galen, that American society gives a leg up to white people and that things could be made more equitable if white people acknowledge the societal advantages of having been born white. But you have critics, on the other hand, who will argue that CRT stokes divisions and might even say it's racist to examine the role of race in U.S. systems and structures. They will also say that critical race theory is Marxist framework that suggests the nation is inherently evil or that white people shouldn't feel guilty about their skin color. So critics are going a little bit off from what critical race theory actually does, but that seems to be the two main arguments that I'm seeing for it.
Alex is right in the sense that where the current debate is now is far from what I think was conceived of in the ivory towers, as is often the case with debates like this. And it's because the concept of critical race theory is really multifaceted. It intersects in your home life, it intersects how you operate in school, in the workplace. It touches everything. And by that very definition, it's really hard to nail down what that means in terms of addressing it, what that means in terms of having conversations around it. And so then I think when you have bad actors where you want to latch on to any question of race, any question of racism, and just give it a bogeyman labeling, you can do that very easily with a concept like this that is hard to nail down specifically. I mean, to be clear, we have, but it is still a theory and a concept for how we move structurally in society, and a lot of people I don't think have the appetite or bandwidth to have real debates around that, and so it's very easy to paint it as one-sided, and anything that has to do with questioning racism in America and what that still means today.
Yeah, I think the term, when Republicans use it in particular, has come to mean something much bigger. It's a kind of a stand-in for all of the fears that white Republicans have about America becoming a more diverse place, about questioning the traditional narrative of American history, questioning the idea that America is exceptional, and specifically with the element of teaching it in schools. I think it also plays into things that we saw, like with Common Core, this idea that wokeness or liberals are going to appropriate what their children are learning, and therefore their children won't share the old-timey values of America that they grew up with. I just think it's such a loaded term that clearly goes beyond the academic definition now.
So, two big questions here. One, is this a classic two-party political issue in that Democrats are saying critical race theory is correct, this academic theory from the 1970s correctly describes American society, and is pushing for it to be adopted in schools or just as a kind of framework for understanding American society, and then Republicans are pushing back against it? And if that's not the case, if this is not just a two-party issue with one party pushing for and the other party pushing against, how did it loom so large in certain parts of American politics today?
I'm not aware of any national Democrats against critical race theory. I'm very tempted to believe this is a partisan issue because critical race theory, for the most part, was flying under the radar until Trump last year ordered federal agencies to stop anti-racism training, that addressed topics like critical race theory or white privilege, and he also was very critical of the 1619 Project. I think he called it warped and distorted. And then you fast forward to 2021, and a number of Republican-dominated states have passed a ban to critical race theory teachings in schools. So I think Trump definitely played a role in politicizing it and getting us to the point where we are today.
Alex is right that national Democrats have not really come out against critical race theory. That said, though, I think this is more complicated than just a Republican think it's bad, Democrats think it's good issue. So at this point, there's a...
This is Aaron. Morning. Okay, let me see if we have. I know we were really low. Yeah, because when I was on campus last week, I think we literally had one and it ended up getting handed out. And you say it's dead, just it won't boot up at all. Okay. Well, Zach isn't answering me, so he must not be at his desk. So I don't know if we have any loaners or not. You might have her just go down to the office and ring the doorbell, and then ask Zach there if we have any. Okay. If she's not, and then I don't know yet. I'll have to answer her in a ticket, I guess. Just because Zach's not answering at the moment. So if she's on campus, she can ring the doorbell and see, but otherwise, I guess I'll have to update you on a ticket whether or not we have one. That's fine. Go ahead and put her through, Elliot. Yep. Okay. So hi, Jennifer. I honestly don't know if we have any loaners in stock. I was on campus last week and we were out at that point. But I've asked Zach if we have any, and he hasn't answered me, so he must be working on something else at the moment. So if you're on campus, you could go ring the doorbell and ask him directly. If you're off campus, I'll have to send you an email when I hear back from Zach whether or not we have any loaners. Okay. Okay, so like I said, as soon as I hear back from Zach, I can let you know whether or not we have one or not. And as far as troubleshooting your current machine, since it won't turn on at all, we probably will have to get that dropped off with us to troubleshoot that and see what's going on. Since we obviously won't be able to remote to it when it won't power on. So I can email you that link to schedule that as well. To like a computer on campus? Okay. Okay. All right. So yeah, basically, I'll keep you updated. Do you get email like on your phone or something, or another computer? Okay. All right. So I'll keep you updated through that ticket and let you know kind of what our next step is from there. Yep. No problem. Bye.
Here's Comes up empty. Strike three. No runs, one hit, no errors, two men left on base. Indianapolis 0, the Giants 0. And the game heads into the seventh inning. Ground ball between third and shortstop, on to first. Out. One away. Roberts is retired on an infield grounder. Next up, Aaron Rowans, riding an 8-game hitting streak is now the plate off the head of the bat. The fielder is under it. He got it. Our next batter, Ryan Garco. Strike. Infield grounder. On to first. Out. There's the third out. No runs, no hits, no errors. We enter the bottom of the seventh inning. The Giants 0, Indianapolis 0.
YouGov Economist poll that did show that 70% of Americans, which is an overwhelming majority, think racism is somewhat a problem. So, kind of a proxy then for critical race theory, because that's what it says continues to be a problem in society. That said, though, there was a gap among Democrats on who saw racism as a problem and support for critical race theory, with more Democrats in support of critical race theory. And the reason why I highlight that gap is I think it goes to something that 538 contributor Neil Lewis wrote for us recently, which is that when it comes to understanding racial inequality, particularly among white Americans, there's a really big misperception. They underestimate the extent to which it exists. And I think you're seeing that in that YouGov Economist poll in the sense that Democrats believe that critical race theory is a way to think about inequality, but when confronted with the extent to which inequality still exists in the US, they underestimate it. And so that opens up, I think, in the same way that the debate around cancel culture has shown to resonate a little with moderates, or at the very least, it doesn't turn them off. And this is like another convoluted chapter in that debate. I think something similar could factor into this, right? Like, I personally believe racism is wrong, but when asked to confront in a poll the extent to which it exists, maybe I don't see that in my life given what my neighborhood, my family looks like. And I think as we get closer to the 2022 election, this isn't going anywhere. And there's also, on the flip side of this, I think a really concerted effort. There was this great quote in this NBC article that talked about the role in which this is playing out in schools. And Christopher Rufo was kind of like the architect among critical race theory emerging back in conservative circles. Adam Harris had pointed this out in a really great Atlantic piece earlier this year on the topic. But anyhow, in this tweet he says, "The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans." So if that continues to be the strategy for the next 2 years, and it remains as amorphous and convoluted as that, I think you could see a real upswing in the types of voters that plays with, particularly because it's so personal. It makes you confront what equity means.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the polling that we have on this and where Americans come down, right? So you said that more than 70% of adults think racism is somewhat of a problem or a big problem in society. That was from the Economist YouGov poll. So that included, according to this poll, 57% who believe racism is a sign of broader problems that exist within the country's organizational, societal, and legal structures. Now, that is kind of what critical race theory is. So that 57% say they believe it's a sign of broader problems. 62% of all Americans think the police sometimes operate in racist ways, compared with 25% who don't. 46% think Congress can be racist. 48% say racism can exist within banks and financial institutions. Lastly, 58% reckon corporations can be racist. So here we have Americans saying that at times all institutions, legal, financial, political, can be racist as institutions, not just somebody being mean to somebody else based on the color of their skin. So it seems like people are generally open to this idea that our society is shaped by racism in some way, but then pretty thoroughly reject critical race theory. I mean, it's not even particularly overwhelmingly popular with Democrats. So is this another branding thing where, like, a lot of Democrats think that there should be some funding moved away from certain areas of policing and into more mental health kinds of treatments and care when that is part of why the police are called versus the defund the police? Like, is this a branding thing? What's going on with this debate?
So, first of all, I think it's important to note that still a lot of people, as you mentioned up top, Galen, aren't familiar with critical race theory, and I think that that group is disproportionately Democrats. I think that the term, much like cancel culture, has mostly been used on the right, on Fox News, etc., and so that's skewing the numbers. Those who are capable of forming an opinion of critical race theory do skew against it for that reason. But yeah, I think that you see this all across politics. You've seen it for years, where when an idea that is complex gets boiled down to a pithy, often partisan slogan, it causes people to stop seeing the nuance of the issue and default toward what their party believes or what they think their party is supposed to believe. So, you see it with Black Lives Matter. Like, the statement that the lives of black people in America are important, I think, is, if you kind of hold it in that way, I think it would get overwhelming support. But the slogan, Black Lives Matter, which literally says the same thing but has become this political slogan, is pretty divisive in America today. You've also seen it on issues like Obamacare. Pretty much every proposal in Obamacare covering people with pre-existing conditions, letting people up to a certain age stay on their parents' health insurance plans, those were all overwhelmingly popular, but because it was branded as Obamacare, when you ask about that, it becomes a divisive issue. So I don't think that that's anything new in American politics, and I think you can add this to the list of things that people support in theory when you describe it in wonkish or abstract terms, but when you filter it into the culture war lens and framing and branding, the results are kind of predictable.
I want to push back a little bit on the branding framing here, just in the sense that this conversation really started to bubble up in the wake of the racial protests last summer and the steps then that various agencies, companies were trying to take internally in terms of raising awareness among employees around systemic biases, what that means in the workplace. And then this term kind of cropped up on the right. Initially, in some of the papers, critical race theory wasn't mentioned. It was the white privilege component. I think Republicans are struggling to define what critical race theory is. I think the same is true of Democrats. There was that editorial that blew up the other day of the Republican lawmaker in Alabama who, when push came to shove, couldn't really defend what critical race theory was or define what it looked like in the schools, even though he had been an architect of the bill to ban it in that state. What we're really talking about and fighting about is the extent to which Americans can talk about race and racism, frankly, and who gets to control that discussion. And right now, it's a fight over control, and it has real consequences. You look back to the different history textbooks that states have had. Kids in the South are taught about the Civil War differently than kids in the North or in California, and that has real consequences when it comes to thinking about what does it mean to be American. And so I think this conversation right now is less about the actual minutia of what critical race theory is or isn't. And to be clear, like, some progressives actually have quibbles with what CRT stands for and if that's the best way to address equity. And it's instead become this catch-all term for anything that has to do with race and the conversation around it.
I totally agree with Sarah there. I think a lot of this boils down to how much we really want to address racism at its core and its impact on American society. Like she was saying, after a very turbulent year of protests against police brutality and disproportionate police violence against black people in 2020, some educators did expand their curriculums on racial inequalities, and now they include some more racialized historical events like the Tulsa Race Riot and highlight the plight of black and brown people in the United States. But as we've seen from Republicans recently, with them voting against a bipartisan commission to examine January 6th, their moves on the voting bill that we talked about earlier, I think they really just want to avoid discussions of race, period. And that's kind of where we're seeing a lot of the backlash that we see now.
Does this seem like the kind of thing that could turn into a broader movement of opposition akin to the Tea Party or, for example, the resistance movement that we saw while Trump was in office?
100%. NBC recently did a really great deep dive into how critical race theory is playing out in schools and school boards. And what was really powerful about the reporting in that story was they told it through what was happening in one school, but then they expanded it out to, like, here's what it looks like across the nation. And they found that 165 local and national groups have already aimed to either disrupt lessons on race and gender, and then that there are 50 separate recall efforts to actually take local elected officials in office, recall them, remove them from office, and that's according to a new report from Ballotpedia. But also the extent to which different legislatures are taking up the bills, or Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Iowa, Montana, Oklahoma, and Tennessee, they already have some form of restriction on the books. 15 other states are considering legislation. This is something that is building up for a movement because it's about America's children. So you have activated, motivated parents who are filing FOIA requests. And for our listeners, the reason why I'm kind of like shocked at that is that's something journalists do, where it's like, okay, we want to find the truth with how government is moving on XYZ issue. Like, this is very dedicated grassroots efforts, and I think it's concerted and organized. That's what NBC found in their reporting in terms of the scope of this. And again, because it deals with America's children, I think that's something that a lot of parents can then rally behind, or at least be invested and curious about.
I think that's interesting, Sarah, that you see that so clearly. I'm kind of less certain that it will have the same kind of momentum. I don't know. I just feel like it hasn't risen to the level of the Tea Party yet. It could, but I guess I think if you look at things like maybe there are local chapters on the local level, but this hasn't translated to a Republican weave environment yet, and the way that obviously 2010 eventually did. I guess there's still a lot of proof is in the pudding stuff in terms of seeing if primary challenges to Republicans succeed and what's going to happen in 2022, but the Tea Party represented the first release of a lot of pent-up resentment and grievance that I think was fully released with the Trump election and Trump's time in office on January 6th. And I guess I'm not sure how much air is left in that balloon. I kind of feel like it's all out now, but we shall see.
That's a really good point, because like one question I have just moving into 2022 more broadly and electorally, and like what that means is the suburbs. And at this point, you could see something like the critical race theory fights in the suburbs, maybe then swinging some of those voters back to the GOP. But I also might be overestimating the appeal that that actually has to a lot of parents. It could be that this is seen as socialism, right? That was supposed to be the big boogeyman in 2020, and that didn't really pan out all that much. So this, to your point, I think could be a similar situation, and I'm giving it too much credence.
It also seems to have remained on the state and local level in a way that obviously the Tea Party and resistance to Trump did not. The national press is covering this every day in the way that they're covering what's happening in Washington, D.C. or the coronavirus or something like that. People obviously trust their local news sources that might be covering this quite a bit in today's media environment.